Iran's recent protests, emerging as a significant wave of civil unrest, are the culmination of a myriad of socio-political and economic factors. This surge in public dissent is not an isolated event but the result of long-standing grievances and systemic issues within Iranian society. The protests reflect deep-seated frustrations among various sections of the population, exacerbated by recent events and policies. The immediate trigger for the protests can often be traced back to specific government actions or incidents perceived as unjust by the public. These triggers, varying in nature, often ignite underlying discontent that has been simmering for years. The government's handling of these incidents is usually seen as a litmus test of its responsiveness to public demands and grievances. Economic hardship is a central driver of the protests. Widespread unemployment, high inflation, and a plummeting currency have severely impacted the daily lives of Iranians. International sanctions, primarily due to Iran's nuclear program, have compounded these economic woes, leading to a sense of desperation and anger among the populace. Political repression and lack of civil liberties play a significant role in fueling the protests. The Iranian government's strict control over political expression, its crackdown on dissent, and the limited scope for political reform have led to widespread disillusionment, especially among the youth and the educated classes. Social issues, including women's rights and minority rights, are also at the forefront of the protests. Discriminatory laws and practices, along with the government's failure to address these concerns adequately, have galvanized various social groups to join the protests, seeking more significant social freedoms and equality. The impact of international relations and geopolitics cannot be ignored when analyzing these protests. Iran's confrontational stance with the West, its involvement in regional conflicts, and the resultant isolation have significant implications for its domestic and foreign policy, which in turn affect public sentiment. The protests are also a reflection of generational divides within Iranian society. A large proportion of the population is young and increasingly exposed to global ideas and values, which clash with the traditionalist and conservative ideologies promoted by the Iranian regime. The role of technology and social media has been pivotal in organizing and amplifying the protests. Despite government attempts to control the internet and social media, these platforms have been crucial in mobilizing support, sharing information, and bringing international attention to the protesters' demands and grievances. Environmental issues have also emerged as a catalyst for some protests. Issues such as water scarcity, pollution, and environmental mismanagement have sparked public outrage, particularly in regions that are directly affected by these problems. The protests also reflect broader regional ethnic and sectarian tensions. Minority groups in Iran, including Kurds, Arabs, and Baluchis, have often voiced their discontent with the central government's policies, which they perceive as discriminatory or neglectful of their regions. Corruption and mismanagement within the government and public institutions are another critical factor behind the protests. The perception of widespread corruption, nepotism, and the lack of transparency has eroded public trust in the government and its institutions. The protests are not homogeneous and encompass a wide range of demands and grievances. From demands for economic reforms to calls for political freedom and social justice, the protests bring together diverse sections of society, each with its unique set of expectations and aspirations. The government's response to the protests has been a mix of concession, repression, and propaganda. While there have been instances of the government making conciliatory gestures, more often, the response has been heavy-handed, with crackdowns on protesters, arrests, and media censorship. The role of external actors and international support for the protesters is a subject of contention. While some protesters seek moral and political support from the international community, the government often labels this as foreign interference, using it to justify its repression of the protests. The resilience and evolution of the protests over time demonstrate the depth of discontent in Iranian society. Despite the risks and the government's repressive tactics, the continued willingness of people to protest indicates a significant level of public dissatisfaction and a demand for change. The protests have had international implications, affecting Iran's relations with other countries, its image abroad, and its foreign policy. The international community's reaction to the protests, ranging from support for the protesters to concerns about stability and security, reflects the global significance of the events in Iran. The economic fallout from the protests is significant, affecting both the national economy and the lives of ordinary Iranians. The instability and uncertainty brought about by the protests have implications for investment, trade, and overall economic confidence in the country. The future trajectory of the protests is uncertain. They have the potential to bring about significant change in Iranian society and politics, but they also face considerable challenges, including government repression, internal divisions, and the complexity of addressing the underlying causes of the unrest. In conclusion, Iran's recent protests are a multifaceted phenomenon, rooted in economic struggles, political repression, social issues, and environmental concerns. They reflect the deep divisions and challenges within Iranian society and have significant implications for the country's future. Thank you for watching this in-depth analysis. Please remember to like and subscribe to Middle East Info for more comprehensive coverage of critical regional developments.